Good morning. When Bernard Lewis passed away, many people offered appreciations of his life's work. They included friends, students, admirers, and detractors. There were obituaries in all the prestige newspapers and heartfelt farewells in magazines and journals. In the midst of these farewells, one couldn't help but feel the absence of one voice. I'm referring to the voice of Fouad Ajami. Whenever Lewis passed some landmark in his last years, it was Ajami who most eloquently celebrated him. I think most notably of his 90th birthday in 2006, which we celebrated at a grand affair in Philadelphia, organized by Bunsey Churchill, who's here today. In honor of the fete, Ajami wrote a marvelous article in the Wall Street Journal of that very day. In 2012, when Lewis turned 96, Tel Aviv University staged a gala in his honor at the Pierre Hotel in New York, and Ajami delivered the centerpiece plaudit to the honoree. On both occasions, Ajami's appreciations of Lewis were absolutely pitch perfect. They were witty and playful, but also earnest and quite serious. Both tributes confirmed Ajami's standing as Lewis's premier disciple. And ASMIA itself rested on this partnership. Lewis was the founding chair of the association, Ajami the founding vice chair. Am I correct? If one goes on the internet, one finds these splendid interviews of Lewis by Ajami under ASMIA's auspices. And Ajami did other chores of discipleship. It was Ajami who reviewed Lewis's books in the Wall Street Journal and in the New York Times, and it was Ajami who put together a last collection of Lewis's essays. It's called The End of Modern History in the Middle East, and Ajami wrote the foreword. So when Lewis died, it was Fouad Ajami, his disciple, who should have had the last word. But we all know the story. Ajami died in 2014, only 68 years of age, felled by cancer. Among the many things we lost in this tragedy were not only many more years of his wisdom, we also lost his final word on Bernard Lewis. Indeed, if nature had only respected its own order of things, Ajami this very day would be memorializing Lewis in our plenary session as his successor and heir to the chairmanship of this association. This thought has inspired me to devote my few minutes to giving Ajami a chance to speak to us on Lewis. And it's only fair. I've already had my say elsewhere. I was privileged to speak at Lewis's funeral in Israel and later wrote appreciations of Lewis for the website of Foreign Affairs and for the next issue of ASMIA's journal. And because this is ASMIA, and because I was a student and friend of both Lewis and Ajami, giving Ajami a voice seems to me the right thing to do. Since time is short, what I want to do is focus on three aspects of Lewis that inspired Ajami. First, his approachability. Second, his prescience. And last, his courage. First, approachability. Lewis spent his first 58 years in Britain. While he came to America from time to time as a visiting professor, he didn't relocate to Princeton until late in his career. And under other personal circumstances, he might well have remained in London until the end. He was in many respects an Englishman. He had an abiding love for the King's English, a barely concealed contempt for its American distortions, and a sharp sense of irony which he thought Americans totally lacked. Among his other peculiarly English traits was a certain reserve. Lewis was not a backslapper, to say the least, and people often kept their distance in awe of his formidable reputation. But Ajami tells a wonderful story about his earliest encounters with Lewis in Princeton when Ajami was a junior faculty member there. This was before Ajami came to Johns Hopkins, so it would have been about 1974. And I quote him. This is Ajami speaking. "My verbal range with the great man was quite limited at the time. I would run into Bernard Lewis and would say, 'Hello, Professor Lewis. Good morning, Professor Lewis. Good evening, Professor Lewis.' He was then the exalted Dodge Professor of Near Eastern Studies, and I occupied the lowly position of postdoc, or something like lecturer, which, if you know the academic hierarchy, really meant that at social events I talked to the caterer. So I think that at some point, Professor Lewis grew tired of my deference, and he took me aside and said, "You may call me Bernard." Well, the only thing I could say, again, I was still intimidated, was to say, "Okay, Professor Lewis." My lifelong, and I'm continuing with Ajami, my lifelong devotion to this great man came when he asked me, "Where are you from?" He asked me about my birthplace. So I told him I was Lebanese. I was born in Lebanon. He said, "I know. You were born in southern Lebanon." I said, "Yes, southern Lebanon." He said, "What's the name of your village?" So I had this village, Arnoun, which is this village without a paved road at the end of the world, a forsaken place. I told him I was from Arnoun. And he said, "You should come over. I will show you the land deeds of Arnoun." I came over and I saw the land deeds of Arnoun. So he gave me the history of that forsaken place, and I think that was the first gift. It's a wonderful story of how the towering Lewis let down his guard for a timid someone he thought held promise. You may call me Bernard. Once in America, he gave this license generously, and all of us who were his students remember how much it meant when he said it. In America, the man of reserve became approachable. And while he still inhabited the world of scholars, and there's no more ivory tower than the Institute for Advanced Study, he decided to write for the great public. At first in Commentary magazine, later in Foreign Affairs and The Atlantic and The New Yorker, the man of reserve thrust himself into the arena, which also meant indulging the media. And amazingly, he seemed to enjoy it. As Ajami put it, from the archive to meet the press, and we were lucky to have that. Lewis was now willing to enter the fray, to speak in sound bites, to instruct novices, to submit to interrogation by the likes of Charlie Rose. It's this openness that made Lewis, and I think Ajami too, into Americans. Second, prescience. Every student of the Middle East, every expert on the Middle East knows the question. It's asked from the Thanksgiving table to the Oval Office. What will be in the Middle East? This is supposed to be the preserve of the area analyst and the political scientist. The analyst claims a special insight because he knows the details, the backstories, the intel. And the scientist, well, the scientists have their models. Now, Lewis was neither. The wonder of it all, announced Ajami, he was a historian, but he saw into the future. This is the genius of the man. And again, Ajami. Lewis's ability to track Islam's journey over the 70 years of his career and really see the deeper currents of Islam, that is his genius. He is able to bridge the gap between scholarship and modern affairs and make a seamless connection between the past and the present. And again, he weaves for us a web between past and present, and he can pick out over the distant horizons storms sure to reach us before long. And this, we were witnessing an epic jumbling of past and present. It was no fault of this historian that we had placed our bet on the death of the past. So Lewis's edge didn't depend on intel or on models. Instead, it rested upon a command, indeed a total mastery of history. Now, people who want to discredit Lewis depict him as reducing everything to a timeless, unchanging Islam. Untrue, as Ajami perceived. Lewis saw everything through the prism of an unstable, storm-swept history, a history of rise and fall, of victory and defeat, culminating, for now, in the global triumph of the West. Ajami said that Lewis saw through the fraudulent claims of Middle Eastern radicalism. He unmasked demagogues. Now, what were those fraudulent claims? That demagoguery? The notion that this history had ceased to matter, that a new age had dawned, that the Arabs and Muslims had somehow escaped their own legacies to become revolutionaries or socialists or nationalists. Every one of Lewis's most prescient insights or predictions, if you will, rested on the salience of history. Let us listen to Ajami enumerate these predictions, and I quote him. In an allegedly secular world, in the 70s, at a time when religions were thought to be a thing of the past, he warned that political Islam was returning. Right? So this is an allusion to Lewis's landmark essay, The Return of Islam, published in 1976. Ajami again. In the 1990s, at the height of the illusion of globalization, Lewis dismissed that fakery. And it was he, and the late great scholar Samuel Huntington, who warned of a clash of civilizations that would replace the Cold War. Now, this is an allusion to Lewis's famous Atlantic Monthly essay, The Roots of Muslim Rage, published in 1990. And then the most prescient intervention of them all. Again, I quote Ajami. In 1998, long before Osama bin Laden became a household name, Professor Lewis found an obscure Arabic daily published out of London. And now you will ask, Fouad continues, you will ask, why are Arabic dailies published out of London? Because London is the only free Arab city. So Bernard Lewis, he continues, found in that obscure Arabic daily a fatwa by the same Osama bin Laden, calling on Muslims to kill the Americans and their allies, wherever and whenever they can be found, and to plunder their possessions. Professor Lewis translated this fatwa, interpreted for us, and published it in Foreign Affairs under a gripping and correct title, License to Kill. On September 11th, on a clear day like this one, 19 young Arabs brought death and soot and ruin to our streets. Those planes that flew into our building on that day awakened us from our slumber, and Bernard Lewis became a household name. End of quote. Now, none of Lewis's prescient essays relied on polling data or some other empirical metric. In all of them, Lewis took some present text and showed why its historical allusions had a contemporary resonance. Lewis said Ajami had an intuitive feel for the currents of history. The past flowed into the present and into the future. This was Lewis's unique method. The likelihood, the probability that a historian might become a sage and oracle in this country is always next to zero. Lewis achieved this by showing just how history mattered to the likes of Osama bin Laden, and so must matter to us. Third and last, courage. Now, we don't usually think of the academy as a realm in which one need display a lot of courage. To the contrary, the academy works on the opposite principle of the marketplace. You advance not by creating something disruptive, but by ingratiating yourself with the powers that be. Even scholars who've achieved tenure in American universities, probably with the most secure existence ever devised in the history of the species, they can't imagine taking a risk. For most of his career prior to America, Lewis went from accolade to accolade. But his moment of truth came when Edward Said indicted him and impugned the honor of his teachers, mentors, and intellectual forebears. Lewis could have dodged the fight. When faced with a rampaging herd, the normal inclination is just to get out of the way. But as we all know, Lewis didn't. He took on Said in the New York Review of Books and walked into the hate-filled halls of the Middle East Studies Association to debate Said. Ajami said this of Lewis's combat role, and I quote him, "When a new generation of radical scholars came up with the notion that somehow or other you have to belong to that region or give it unbounded fidelity, I think he was able to stand his ground against the disciples of the late Edward Said." Now, Ajami allowed that, and again I quote him, "In most American universities, the battle of ideas between Lewis and Said was, alas, won by Said and his disciples. To me, this is a tragic outcome." But it was a battle, and Ajami held out hope for the longer term. "I think," he said, "history will tell us who told the truth about that Islamic world." And in any case, as Ajami put it, Bernard Lewis is not a coward. All of us look to Lewis not just as a model, but as a champion, and he didn't shirk from the assignment. Of course, Fouad Ajami had courage in abundance, which would be another story. I would just mention here that Lewis acknowledged it. I don't believe that Lewis ever wrote anything about Ajami, except the odd book blurb. But he dedicated a book to him, a collected volume, where we read this: "For Fouad Ajami, in appreciation of his scholarship, friendship, and courage. The moral courage to speak the truth, even when it means exposing oneself to the vitriol of armies of distorters and propagandists, is a rare thing in an academic. Lewis and Ajami fortified one another by standing together. And this association is one product of that solidarity. I conclude. Our topic has been the enduring legacy of Bernard Lewis. Lewis had much to say about many things: Islam, democracy, freedom, Israel, anti-Semitism, Iraq, and much more. How much of that legacy will endure is an open question. We can differ over these issues too. But it seems to me that Ajami touched on three aspects of Lewis's legacy that we are enjoined to preserve. First, approachability. We must, as scholars, emulate Lewis by stepping out of the comfortable ivory tower and sharing our knowledge and insights with the public that sustains us. It's a duty, and he showed us how to fulfill it honorably and responsibly. The second legacy, we must emulate Lewis in knowing and respecting the history of the people we study. There's an insatiable demand for instant expertise. We should never proffer it. If we're going to have the audacity to make predictions, we have an obligation to base them on something more substantial than the daily briefing. In his memoirs, Lewis wrote, and I quote him, "Time and again I have chatted with government officials concerning the problems of the Middle East. They are always highly educated and often remarkably competent, with a detailed and intimate knowledge of the problem with which they are involved from the moment of their own involvement. But they sometimes display surprising gaps in their knowledge of what went before." End of quote. We as scholars have to work to close our own gaps. This is the added value we bring, and not just the historians among us. And finally, courage. There is never an excuse for not speaking the truth as we see it, whatever the consequences. Yes, we must choose our battles, especially the young among us. But once we choose them, we must fight them as Lewis and Ajami fought theirs, without compromise, without apology, and without looking over our shoulders. Ajami once said this of Lewis: "We shan't see the likes of him again." Certainly, in his erudition, his ability to synthesize, his mastery of English prose and difficult languages, I don't expect to live to see anyone in our field combine these gifts again. But we all have the potential to be approachable, and knowledgeable, and courageous. Whether Lewis's legacy endures now depends on us. So let us pledge to emulate him whenever it's in our power and competency. It's the best hope for the discipline we call our own. Thank you.